This week I'm joined by Michael Martin, who is a biodynamic farmer, philosopher, theologian, poet and musician. He's also the director of the Centre for Sophiological Studies. He is the author of The Incarnation of the Poetic Word, Theological Essays on Poetry and Philosophy, and also the book we're speaking about today, The Submerged Reality, Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics. In this episode, we discuss theology, sophiology and phenomenology. I'd like to thank all my patrons for making this project possible, and if you'd like to support Hermitix podcast or become part of the Hermitix community, please find our Patreon, Discord and donation links in the description below. Enjoy. Michael Martin, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
My pleasure.
So just before we jump into the Hermitix question, so we're going to be talking about your book, The Submerged Reality, Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics, which was a title which truly drew me in. But before we begin, just a sort of overview of your past and your work and sort of the directions you're taking, the questions you're trying to answer with what it is you do.
I've done a lot of things in my life. I started off as a musician and had a record contract when I was 18. But by the time I was 26, I was pretty disenchanted with the music business. And in the meantime, I had started doing a lot of reading. And eventually, long story short, I was a Waldorf teacher for 16 years. And then I've been involved in biodynamic farming and gardening for about 30 years now. And in fact, we run a small biodynamic farm here in Michigan. Concurrently with all that stuff, I was finishing my education. I have a PhD in English literature. And my expertise in English literature is in 16th and 17th century early modern literature, especially religious texts and poetry. And I remember when I was writing my dissertation, I knew a bit about Sophiology already, but hadn't undertaken kind of a comprehensive investigation into it. But during that investigation into 17th century poetry, and in particular into the poetry of Henry Vaughan and the writing of his brother, his twin brother Thomas, I realized there was a heck of a lot of Sophiology and Hermeticism in there, and that the presence of Jakob Böhme was very strong. And then I finished up that dissertation, which was later published as a book called Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England. And the last chapter in that book is on Jane Lead. If you're familiar with her, from the Philadelphian Society. She lived basically through the entire 17th century. And she was a visionary and religious leader, and the centerpiece of her mysticism was her experience of Sophia. Mm-hmm. Who came to her in a vision and said, "I will now be your mother." So all this stuff was percolating in 17th century. And when I was writing that chapter, I remember a footnote. I don't know if it's in the final version, but it was definitely in the dissertation version. I said somebody should write a book about this. Yeah, and that was actually I was originally planning on writing a book on Sophiology in 17th century English literature. And it became something different once I got into the project and became the Submerged Reality.
So you say you were a Waldorf teacher?
I was a Waldorf teacher.
That
Waldorf education was founded by Rudolf Steiner in 1920. No, right after World War I in England, and 1919 I think it was. And it's a holistic education that integrates the arts into every topic. Every subject is imbued with the arts, and it's And I visited a Waldorf school, I don't know, a few years before I started working there, and I saw how alive the children seemed and how unspoiled by the media they were. And mm-hmm. so it was kind of inspiring. So gradually I was kind of pulled into it. I hadn't planned on it, but I worked at a bookstore, and I knew quite a few Waldorf teachers who came in there to buy books, and they kept telling me, "You'd be a great Waldorf teacher." So they hired me as an apprentice teacher, and that's how I did my training.
Were you familiar with Steiner's work at the time, or?
I was. I mean, I was pretty familiar, not extraordinarily familiar, but it all kind of came together at the same time. My training in being a Waldorf teacher, but also my interest in biodynamic farming, and it all came together at the same time. And interestingly, at the time, so this is probably about 1991 or 92. And the guy who was training me as a gardener had worked with Alan York, if you've heard of him, who ended up being a really important figure in late 20th and early 21st century farming, because Alan was the one who he left his farm in about 1992 because he was doing so much consulting, and he was consulting for wineries and vineyards, because at that time they were afraid that within 20 years there would be no more grapevines left on earth because they're being ravaged by pests and disease. And he's the one who introduced biodynamics into viticulture. And now, I mean, he died a couple years ago, unfortunately, but you can find videos on the internet and all kinds of things about Alan, how he really revolutionized the wine industry, and I would say he saved it, by bringing in sustainable methods.
Is this sort of a hidden history of the wine industry that it almost just ended?
Well, I think people forget about it now. I mean, look, we forget what happened a month ago.
Yeah.
But at the time, I remember it was a real anxiety in the wine industry, and I remember when Alan told us that he was doing this, I'm like, it's crazy. How's he gonna? But 20 years later, or 30 years later, almost, it's amazing how many wineries. In fact, there's one video you can find on YouTube that Sting from the Police hired Alan as a consultant to rejuvenate a vineyard he bought in Italy. So it's all over the place, and it's actually become very mainstream.
Wow! With such an eclectic past, I'm genuinely curious as to the answer to the next question, which is the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, in a room, listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
I would probably pick Rudolf Steiner, Martin Heidegger, and maybe Nicholas Berdyaev, the Russian philosopher. I don't know if you know him. No. There's a lot of people I could pick. That's who I would pick today.
Yeah. How come Heidegger?
Oh, Heidegger. So much of what I do in Sophiology comes out of phenomenology. Mm-hmm. And Steiner was grounded in phenomenology. In fact, the first place I heard about it was as a Waldorf teacher, and we'd do studies on children. They would try to work phenomenologically, but they weren't. But it was really interested me to see how to come to let phenomenon speak, mm-hmm. right? And then when I was probably I read Heidegger the first time I tried to read Being and Time. I didn't know what to make of it. So Steiner was a contemporary of Husserl, mm-hmm. And they both studied around almost the same time under Franz Brentano, one of the founders of phenomenology, and then Heidegger kind of took it to the next step. But both of them, they came to their insights through a phenomenological reduction, I think. And I think what happens in phenomenology, and this is what I think you see much later, like William Desmond and Jean-Luc Marion and a lot of thinkers, through that phenomenological reduction, you can only call it a spiritual disclosure that can happen. Mm-hmm. When the things open up. And maybe another person you could throw into who I'd like to talk to would be Goethe. Mm-hmm. So because it kind of started with him as well in his scientific work.
It's interesting. The interview that I recorded prior to this was with a Maronite priest who was on about Syriac tradition of phenomena is completely sort of embedded in phenomena is the divine in all phenomena, and it's the sort of the journey of a pious person to get to the point where you see the divine behind each and every piece of phenomena. So it's a strange coincidence.
That's it.
So is that where this room that you have is sort of as a way to talk about phenomenology as opposed to Sophiology? Do you, perhaps before we go into the specifics of Sophiology, for those who aren't as religiously centered, just a quick overview of what Sophiology sort of is, because it's quite a controversial topic in religious.
Absolutely, religious circles. But Sophiology essentially is Sophia, of course, means wisdom, and in Proverbs 8, for instance, wisdom speaks. Sophia speaks, and she's kind of like the handmaiden of Yahweh as He creates the universe. And it's kind of so it's really the beauty of creation, the beauty of creating is part of this understanding. And I think this is what's disclosed through even a phenomenological reduction, and I'm probably not of everything, but attentiveness to nature, to works of art. You hear it all, so many times these kinds of things happen. People kind of let down their guard while they're attending to these phenomena, because the idea with the phenomenological reduction is you don't sit there and judge the thing. You rather attend to experience, and you're present to what's there. And then what you can think about it is something shines through the phenomena. So what Sophia is in that context, we could, and this William Desmond talks about this a little bit, is the metaxu, or the between. So Sophia becomes this between the spiritual world and between the physical world, between philosophy and theology, between poetry and philosophy. So it's kind of and this is what Desmond calls a porosity, right? Mm-hmm. It becomes porous, and those kinds of distinctions or boundaries we tend to put around our categories kind of start to dissolve in the face of that. And so that's kind of like, we could say, the philosophical or theological iteration of Sophiology. But there's another side of Sophiology of, like I mentioned with Jane Led, with a visionary experience where people actually experience a divine feminine being who comforts or guides them. And this happened with Jane Led, as I mentioned, happened with Vladimir Soloviev, happened with, I'm reading this book by the Russian poet Daniel Andreev. It happened with him as well. He happened with him in the 1930s through the 50s. Also, the Russian priest Sergei Bulgakov is a super important sophiologist, as well as his friend and colleague, another priest, Pavel Florensky. But those two guys don't speak about their personal experiences of a Sophia being. Bulgakov couches it more in theological language, whereas Florensky, in his book, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, he uses more of a narrative or poetic idiom to describe these experiences. And that's why it's kind of what's interesting to me, or I think what drew me into it is my experience first as a musician, but then later as a poet, and also as a critic of poetry. And my approach to literary criticism I call agapeic, which is being open to the phenomenon before you, rather than coming in at it with an axe to grind, which is what most literary criticism is these days. Whether it's a feminist interpretation, Marxist interpretation, you're sizing that thing up. Whereas I think, that's kind of a dreadful way to approach works of art. Mm-hmm. It's been called by Paul Ricoeur, there's the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So Sophiology, it touches everything, I think. And I think if we brought it down to a kernel. It's where you see the wisdom of God shining through phenomena. That's where it's present.
Okay. Where are the controversies sort of clearest? Why is it so controversial?
Well, it's controversial. Well, it's different reasons. Lots of different reasons for controversy. In Russian Orthodoxy, for instance, one of the first person you can call a Russian Sophiologist was the philosopher Vladimir Soloviev, who was another visionary who had visionary experiences with Sophia. And then his idea was taken up by Florensky and Bulgakov, Berjaev. And the problem in Russian Orthodoxy is they suspect that you're bringing a fourth person into the Holy Trinity, a fourth hypostasis, right? Which it might be what it is. So that's one place where it's controversial, right? Gets people into hot water. In another more contemporary ways, it was controversial, especially in the 70s and 80s, in feminist theology. But this was a militant kind of feminist theology that was trying to that was ignoring the Sophiological tradition of the Russians and trying to basically to make God a woman, which is, I don't even want to go into that, but it was really politically charged, right? It was just like I said about literary criticism. It was not an agapeic reading; it was a political reading, right? But interestingly, in the meantime, and I hadn't heard of this when I wrote the Submerged Reality. Otherwise, I probably would have revised the opening chapter. I don't know if you're familiar with Margaret Barker.
No.
Margaret Barker is a Methodist minister and scholar from England, and she has done a lot of scholarly excavation, and she's really well versed in the ancient languages. That she suspects that the figure we call wisdom or chokmah in the Old Testament, or Sophia in Greek, was actually part of First Temple Judaism. And she's got a book called The Lady in the Temple, which describes this. Now, unlike the kind of feminist Sophiology, we can call it, I guess, from the 70s and 80s and early 90s that was politically charged, hers is not politically charged. She's drawing on evidence, and just like an archaeologist, piecing together the puzzle, trying to see what it is. And I think she's got a good point. One of the things she points to is that most of what we call the wisdom books in the Old Testament, the book of Sirach and the book of Wisdom, parts of Job, which were written for the most part in Greek in North Africa, in Alexandria. And she proposes that the Jewish community in Alexandria was actually exiled from Israel when they rejected King Josiah's reforms, which part of Josiah's reforms was to throw the lady out of the temple, right? So they got rid of that part of Judaism, and but I think this community in North Africa preserved it, because those wisdom books are filled with allusions to Sophia, which is kind of interesting.
So, with regards to how it sits now, is it still, if you were to bring this up in sort of seminars or conferences, is this still the black sheep of Christianity?
Not as much as it was.
No.
In the 20th century, there are still people who are suspicious of it, but there's more and more scholars taking up this idea. And some are critical, like my friend who I think I can't remember what university he's at, but he's in England. He's a Canadian Orthodox deacon with a PhD, and he wrote his name's Brandon Gallagher, and he's critical of Sophiology, but he's not paranoid about it. He's not asking anybody to be excommunicated, and I like him quite a bit. He's been critical and encouraging of my work at the same time. So it's not like it was, and there are there are more and more people getting interested in Sophiology, and kind of what is called mainstream theology. It's being taken much more seriously than it was before. And I think actually Pope Francis, in his earlier encyclical Laudato Si, I think he's the thing is with Catholic mainstream theologians, they got to keep they have to keep a straight face. But when I read Laudato Si, I was like, wow, this is filled with Sophiology. And Pope John Paul II, for instance, was also interested in Sophiology, but more, I guess, theologians and Catholic thinkers who have the freedom to not be part of the mainstream. They more or less embrace Sophiology. Thomas Merton's one example. Mm-hmm. Also, there was a poet William Everson, if you've heard of him. He went by the name Brother Antoninus for a while because he was in religious life, but then he left. And they both have extraordinary sophiological intuitions, as well as a person who's really controversial in Catholic circles to this day, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. But he's got a prose poem or prose essay, I don't know what to call it, poetic essay called the Divine Feminine or the Eternal Feminine. And it's extraordinarily sophiological because he was a scientist. And this is what's another thing that interests me is Sophiology is not necessarily cannot just necessarily be confined to theological or philosophical understandings, but it's also has an artistic or poetic component as well as a scientific one, right? Mm-hmm. And I think even if you didn't call it Sophiology, if more of that kind of attentiveness would be taken to things from scientific realms in particular, it might be a very different thing. In fact, you call it the Hermitix podcast, but this idea is really strong in the Hermeticism of especially the 17th century. Mm-hmm. And you notice the Submerged Reality have a chapter on Robert Flood, the Rosicrucian apologist and physician, and it's also in Henry Vaughan and Thomas Vaughan, who are both physicians as well, and you see it to a degree in Rosicrucianism.
Mm-hmm. And I also believe it has some connections with the text meditations on the tarot as well.
Absolutely, yeah,
manner. Yeah. Do you think that the attitude towards Sophiology, which is sort of antagonistic, is because, as you stated at the start, Sophiology has this direct relationship with beauty. It doesn't want to compare things in the way you said, when we criticize something within literature, we go in with a political angle, or we go in with so we go in with some form of attack as opposed to just assessing the thing in its beauty. And it seems that Sophiology is entirely aligned with just pure beauty. It doesn't really want to do it. Do you think that the antagonistic relationship it has with theology and society is because it doesn't align itself with any other sort of camps in that way, and it's difficult to align it with other camps?
Well, yeah, it's kind of an a theoretical theory, right? And I think it is, and actually you see this one Catholic theologian who I think was very much a closet Sophiologist was Hans Urs von Balthasar, who actually wrote a foreword or an afterword for Meditations on the Tarot. And he was made a cardinal just before he died. And von Balthasar's book, The Glory of the Lord, the first sentence is, "Beauty will be our starting point." So he kind of brought it back in. And so importantly, here's to answer your question about the antagonism toward beauty. I think that came through, it took a long time, but it's really by trying to turn philosophy or theology into a science. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the diminishment of beauty came. And it started with nominalism, but it only just started. And it really, I think, gained a lot of traction after the Enlightenment and especially in the 19th century, and then the 20th century, it was, if you get to Paul Tillich and people like that, they're not concerned about, well, I think, especially in Protestant theology, beauty was always suspect from the time of Luther and especially of Calvin. Beauty was they were suspicious of beauty, and one of their criticisms, especially from the Calvinist side of the Catholic Church, was that it's just a performance, right? It's theater,
Mm-hmm.
and so they were taught, and their theology was very much a hermeneutic of suspicion of beauty, because that's how the devil will allure you, right? Right? In fact, if you read John Milton and Edmund Spencer, they're crazy about this stuff. They'll put in these scenes in Paradise Lost and in The Fairy Queen, where they show something being very attractive, like the bower of bliss in The Fairy Queen, and the reader's getting really caught up in the beauty and the sensuality of the thing, and then they'll get to a point they go, see how sinful you are. You just thought that was beautiful, you sinner.
You mentioned that that theology is becoming this sort of, some people wanted to turn it into a form of science, and you have this brilliant quote, which is reason, that is, may incline one toward faith, but it does not compel. So,
right.
What do you think it is about the age of reason, this sort of age of enlightenment push for science, which, do you think they saw beauty as in grace and charity, which Thomas Merton goes on about a lot? Do you think they saw these as sort of antithetical to their aims in terms of enlightenment and reason? They were things that had to be got rid of.
I think they subsumed the suspicion of the supernatural, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that became less and less something that was talked about in theology, and ethics took the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the commandments, ethical ways. So in politics, you could say. So, yeah, the supernatural was, in fact, even if you go back to the 17th century, the Cambridge Platonist Henry Moore was really critical of enthusiasm, as he called it, because what happened during the Civil War in England, or the Civil Wars, the censorship laws kind of got a little slack, and lots of these mystical Protestant tracts were coming out by the Philadelphian Society and other lots of different people. I mean, they were having visions left and right, which you don't hear much about Protestant mysticism today. But in the 17th century, it was a real thing. It was a real phenomenon. And there was an anxiety about it, right? And that there always is an anxiety about mysticism from the theologians, right? Because here's revelation, here's from a person who's not educated or learned in theology, all of a sudden telling us things. This was the problem for another very important sophiologist, Jakob Böhme, the German mystic, but he was a shoemaker. So he starts coming out with these pronouncements about how reality is structured and how God works. The Lutheran theologians were like, somebody tell that guy to shut up. In fact, he was censured by his own pastor. But he wrote, gosh, how many books? Big, incredible. He's really hard to read because he, like Heidegger, in fact, I compare him to Heidegger. If you read Böhme, he didn't have a vocabulary available to him to describe what he was experiencing and seeing. So he borrowed some from alchemy, but he's not writing alchemy. But he's trying to find a way to describe in new language what's going on, which is why it's so hard. And I think that's exactly what happened in the 20th century with Heidegger. I think when people come to Heidegger, at first they're often just puzzled. But then after a while, if you keep at it, all of a sudden the lights go on, right? And the lights go on, I think, in both of those cases by by, in a way, letting go of rationality in the submerged reality. I call it reading holographically.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to be present to it rather than try to force meaning out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of short circuits the analytical function.
Yeah.
You just have to listen, right?
Yeah. Do you still see a sort of relationship towards mysticism, which is much like that? Because I've got it written down here. You might know more than me if there's any contemporary examples of mysticism in this, in this tradition here. I don't know if that's something that would even be possible anymore. The modern seems to have sort of stripped back any possibility of that, at least in the mainstream.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't hear about it, right? But I think there's certainly around. Well, I think now you don't even know how to interpret it. There was an anthroposophical mystic, a Steiner-like mystic who actually was receiving the stigmata, and I think her name's Judith von Halle, and she's still around. She might be in her 60s now, but this was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where people were interested in it's a very anthroposophical kind of mysticism. I don't know what to make of it entirely. I mean, I'm fascinated by it, and I think with mysticism, you try to weigh in on truth or falsehood with mysticism, and it's the wrong way, because mysticism is closer to poetry than it is to philosophy. There was also, I can't remember where she's from. Her name's Joa Bolendas, and with Joa is her first. And she was in, I don't know if she's still alive, but was she Swedish? I can't remember where she was from. But she was the wife of a Protestant pastor, and she started having visions, I think in the 60s or 70s. And there was also this book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's called Talking with Angels. But this takes place a little earlier. This was in Hungary, and these four young people started having visionary locutions from these angels, they said, who were kind of guiding them through the horrors of World War II. And it's kind of a fascinating book, and I understand that, who Juliette Binoche is, the actress. I think she's trying to turn that into a film. But so it's out there. I don't know what's going on right this second. Usually it takes a while before it becomes apparent, but I'm sure there's something going on.
That what you just said there about talking with angels and like a guiding force. I've got it written down here about is it Boehm's understanding of Sophia sort of as a cosmological agent and as an immanent sort of transformative sense of being. It's this. I don't know how you'd put it. I mean, I can't remember if you do describe Sophia as an angel in the book at all, but from what you've said so far in terms of philosophy, she's sort of a phenomenological sort of gateway to God.
Yeah. Right.
A sort of a translator in a way of the language beyond phenomena.
Yeah, like a catalyst almost, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just saw the connection there between Boehm and what you said there. But just to bring it back to the phenomenological understanding, there's a sort of, at least I spent a lot of time with the work of Immanuel Kant, and there was a fairly loaded sentence for me. She said, Sophiology resonates with the ethical commitments of phenomenology in the ways that both return to things in themselves in order to enter into the tastes and colours of the real and honour the qualities and character of that which one beholds. Now, this to me sounds like Sophiology is sort of altering Christianity in such a way that it becomes a transcendental philosophy, and actually God is within Kant's system as opposed to the other way around. Right.
I think it's both. I think it's both transcendent and immanent. And the immanence I think comes through the experience of phenomena. Whether and I see this all the time on my farm. Where things reveal themselves to you. So there's an immanence there. And there's something behind the phenomenon that reveals itself to you as well. But there's also the transcendence is actually the self-transcendence when you kind of enter into it, right? It's kind of almost there's a reciprocity in that relationship. So as as the Sophianic reveals itself to you, you kind of give yourself to the phenomenon at the same time. So it kind of works both ways.
You wouldn't see it sort of as, in a way, a continuation of what phenomenologists, the completion of a system almost, because that discussion of whether or not humans are able to access the real, things along those lines, is this sort of a theological way of answering that question. This is to say, yes, we can, but it's via beauty, via Sophia.
Yeah. Well, I think what happens, I think, with that kind of presence to things, and being, and it doesn't happen. You don't sit down and go, okay, be present to me. It takes time, right? So, which is why it's probably not popular in our society. But it does take time, and it takes, I wouldn't say an aptitude, but it takes the right disposition, right? You can't grasp it. It's not something you can grab. Mm-hmm. It's something that reveals itself, and it's not, and it's, I guess we could say it's through beauty, but it's an intimacy of knowing. You know what I mean? And it's like, you ever have the experience where you might read a poem, you've probably read it, 10 times, but you read it this 11th time, and all of a sudden, boom, something happens, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I think it is. I mean, so I think there's that intimacy of knowing. It's almost, in fact, I described it in the book. It's almost, like when in Genesis where Adam knew Eve. It's that kind of intimacy, where it's not just it's sensual, but it's also ontological. Mm-hmm. Or something in its being. And you can't, people can tell you other things, but, it's unshakable in a way. And it's not, it doesn't give you a kind of deliverable concept to hand to people, right?
Yeah. Well, no,
it's like,
no.
It's like love. Why do you love your wife, right? You do.
Yeah, it's a tough one to articulate. But when we look, just to pop back between the what's happened to theology, do you think there is a possible reversion back to a theology which would be sympathetic to views which you just articulated there, would be more, instead of having to have everything sort of subsumed into the framework of reason,
Yes.
Do you think that?
And you see there are people doing this now, and really important people. I think you see it in the work of John Milbank and William Desmond. You see it in David Bentley Hart, mm-hmm. Adrian Pabst. A lot of people out there who are actually, even to a degree, you could say Charles Taylor. There's Jean-Luc Marion, absolutely, when he talks about saturated phenomenon, right? That's what they're all bumping against the same thing. And even Jacques Derrida, of all people, in his later work that got to be more religious or theological in scope, I think for me, Derrida is a negative theologian.
Do you care to expand on that?
Well, in his book on the name, sur le nom, how to avoid speaking, and there he's really talking about this being present to phenomenon and how the language becomes so insufficient for articulating the experience that you kind of ruin it by speaking of it. By, like I said a second ago, how if you were to explain what love is, or why is it you love a certain person, as soon as you try to explain it, it sounds so cheap. Mm-hmm. And you realize how insufficient language is to that. And this is why I think where poetry comes in, and this is why I call the subtitle of the book is Poetic Metaphysics, because a poetic understanding or a poetic speaking kind of short circuits or subverts that kind of need to have explanations and definitions. Mm-hmm. In fact, when I teach a course for undergrad course. What's it called? Contemplation and Action at a Catholic university nearby, and then they have it arranged where halfway through the course, this person from the administration comes in and has to do something with the students. And they always come in, and whoever it is will say to the students, "I see this course is called Contemplation and Action." Well, what's contemplation? And they never know because I never tell them. And I tell them because they say, "What's contemplation?" I'm not telling you. You have to find out what it is. If I explain it to you, it won't work, right? You have to discover what contemplation is.
So, yeah, that sort of ties in with sort of one of the underlying sort of unspoken truths of Hermeticism, which is the conclusions mean nothing to you if they're explained to you. It's the journey and the personal conclusions, which are they're the things that are only going to mean anything. So I think perhaps from that, do you think that if this ever was, let's say, rigorized into theological study as a matter of course, do you think in some way it would be a bit tarnished, that it would sort of lose, it would lose its potency as an act of belief, as an act of grace, as something which you personally take on?
I think so. I think in Hermeticism, one of the things you see is how strongly the relationship of the microcosm to the macrocosm is emphasized, right? That this is Sophiology, right? You're not separate from the environment. Mm-hmm. If you're familiar with the philosopher and physicist David Bohm, when he talks about implicate order, that our environment, and this is the cosmos, is implied in us, and we are implicit in that. This is where it kind of destroys Descartes, right, with the uninterested observer, which is impossible, right? And this is what phenomenology is. It says the same thing. So I think so that's important, and that implicate order that Bohm talks about, that's Hermeticism, right? That the cosmos is related to us. In fact, when this whole thing with the quarantine and the COVID started, I don't know if you noticed, there was a Indian boy, I can't remember his name, he's 14, and he's an astrologer, and he kind of mapped out, and he did this back in August, I think, that this was going to happen, and he said how long it would last. And when I was paying attention to this, I know a guy who's an astrologer who uses astrology, and he's been doing it for 40 years for investments. He's a stockbroker, and he said, when looking at some configurations in the heavens in Capricorn, which is the sign of money and finance, that he wanted people to shut down the markets until after Jupiter passed Pluto, which would happen a few days before Easter, because he thought it would just wreak havoc with the market, which it kind of did. But also that, and I think we've seen this, that I think the worst is probably over for that. And this, I saw this. This is what the Hermeticists would say, right? They would look at the relationship of the microcosm, of course, of the Earth, to the greater cosm, to the macrocosm, and see. And I think also another thing you could say, another thing we're finding out through this is how disconnected we are from the world. We're connected to the virtual world now. We're not connected to the natural world in any way, really. Mm-hmm. And as we saw, we've been seeing these reports about now that this has been going on for a few weeks, pollution's diminished, rivers and seas are a little cleaner, animals are more awake. So it's a very much a hermetic or sociological reality.
Mm-hmm. Which actually brings us back to Heidegger, which was my primary interest in Heidegger, which was being in the world, where the in of being in the world is older German for innan, which means an innate familiarity. And that's something that Heidegger sort of emphasized, was
our world isn't the Earth. It's more of a I don't want to say atmosphere. I mean, once again, this is one of those problems of articulation, of being able to articulate that familiarity is almost impossible. Yeah. But so yeah, where would you direct anyone to think about? I mean, other than your own book, of course, think about theology and religion as this form of communication between phenomena, and if you're a Kantian, noumena, or
other books that you would like?
Yeah.
Well, I think von Balthasar and the Glory of the Lord. That's a pretty remarkable. I think it's 3 or 4 books. They're pretty remarkable in the way he lays it out. Another one, William Desmond's work, is really important in that way. Milbank, John Milbank's got an essay. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the title exactly, but Sophiology is in the essay. It's about 30 pages long. I mean, you can it's available freely on the internet. That's a really important essay about that. And Milbank's actually been writing a lot about this in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Are there any people who make a distinction then between sort of the forms of belief and prayer for those who are in the Sophiological camp, the more poetic camp, and those who are sort of in the theological camp? Because it seems to me that there's sort of an incompatibility with sincerity and sincere prayer on a sort of like tick boxing your prayers, as opposed to sincerely praying and being charitable.
Well, von Balthasar calls it theology at the desk versus theology at prayer, right? And I think that's something. There's something to it, and I think probably one place where all those things meet is in liturgy, right? Where the artistic, the religious, and the sensual meet in ritual. Mm-hmm. You see it most strongly in Catholic, Anglican, and Orthodox iterations, but they want to make it beautiful, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, make it beautiful. Why? Because it's the glory of the Lord, right? It's how to clothe God in majesty and beauty, And I think the same thing happens. In fact, we have festivals here at our farm a couple times a year, and we've had Catholic masses said in our barn, which is one of the coolest places to have a mass, So there's a lot to be said about the distinctions of theology at prayer versus theology at the desk, and there's a lot of theology at the desk out there. I mean, like Bart Ehrman, if you know him, he's theology at the desk. He doesn't pray, doesn't even believe in God, right? But he's an important biblical theologian, but he doesn't believe in God, right? And that's part of, we could say, is it's kind of the downfall of theology has been the professionalization of theology over the last century and a half, right? And I think when you give things into the hand, and I think this is my criticism of scientists and academics in general, right? You get that kind of professional class, there comes with it a kind of groupthink, or egregore, as Tom Bird calls it, right? This spirit that's created by the group, which disallows original thoughts to come forth. If you're in academia or if you're in theology, if you have a person has an original insight, unless the team's behind it, you will be ostracized. This is how it's going to be, which is what happened to Bulgakov and Soloviev and so many others over history. And that's why I mentioned Nicholas Berdyaev earlier as a person I'd like to talk to. That's what I love about him, because he didn't care. He was kind of a wild man out in the wilderness, like John the Baptist. And just, I shouldn't say railing, but he was in full prophetic mode half of the time. Really, speaking truth to power in a way, I guess you could say. Not that anybody cared, but because they treated him like an outlier. But there's got to be, that's the only way to keep those disciplines alive, is to have some wildness thrown in there that doesn't fit the mold, right? And this is the history of science, right? Mm-hmm. You go through and this is why, even right now, people we have to trust the scientists. Which scientists? Mm-hmm. The ones who told us that margarine was better than butter? The ones that created the opioid epidemic? Mm-hmm. Which scientists should I trust? The ones who funded research in the 60s and 70s to say that smoking didn't cause cancer,
Yeah, I do love that saying, because it's a sort of a non-saying that once you look at it for more than a second, it implicitly shows you how much trust you put in just complete abstract authority. The scientists, TM, scientists said it, so therefore it's fine. And you hear this on the news all the time. It could be scientists or teachers or something along those lines, and that as soon as you say that, everything's fine. But it sidelines, like you say, it's a cheap word, but it sidelines passion, and it sidelines the beauty, which is a shame. But modernity seems to be sort of completely antagonistic to anything like that isn't in some way quantifiable, in some way accountable, and you can put it in a spreadsheet and make sense of it.
And it's interesting. Well, I think that you mentioned that modernity, but also postmodernity, which is for me is modernity plus the internet. Is what that has done is polarizes. So you have to be in a camp, right? You have to be, and there's no, and this is it. Sophiology or Sophia is the metaxit, is the between. There is no between. Usually in a virtual environment. It's either or, either science or religion, right? Right? And and I noticed this through 20 years of teaching college, is there's, even though colleges have been in the States anyway, have emphasized critical thinking for as long as I've been in teaching college, there's less and less of it going on.
Well, I think
people talk about it all the time. I don't see much of it.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, I think that's sort of it's almost like a panopticon. Everyone thinks they're being watched, so they have to abide by the scripture of the scripture of the institution. Yeah. I think the students also probably worry that if they go outside of that they'll lose their positions as well. So it's everyone's held in, but no one wants to be. But it's like you said, it's that first wild card who has to say, you know what? No, I don't care.
So like the Russian term HyperNormalization, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We know it's not real, but we go along with it as if it were.
Yeah. But we've sort of gone off on a digression. But if there's anything you'd like to, I'm sure I've missed quite a bit here because I've gone down the phenomenological route. But is there anything sort of key that we've missed here about Sophiology?
Well, I guess you could say kind of a maxim for Sophiology comes from Goethe. Mm-hmm. He said, where if a man has art and science, he has religion. But if a man has neither art nor science, give him religion, right? And I think that's what I think, that integration of those disciplines, those ways of being, is really important thing to cultivate in especially our times. But I think in general, where the poets who become scientists or the scientists who become poets or musicians or whatever it is, right? Who they have a wider experience of being than what is typically available to us, especially in education we were just talking about. Another thing that's happened over the last 20, 30 years in education is increased specialization, right? Where kids are specializing in whether it's music or science from very early ages, rather than having a wider experience of the world, right? Mm-hmm. It's a kind of a professionalization.
Yeah, so everyone's sort of just getting atomized and no one has the connection, which is,
Absolutely.
So do you think that there's some sort of, it's a cheap pun, but saving grace to be found in Sophia, in that manner of being,
Yeah, I think it gives not only an alternative, but an antidote to all that compartmentalization and I think it also has implications in economics and in ecology.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Bulgakov wrote a really fine book called something economy. I can't remember the title right now, but he proposes a sophiological or a sophianic economy, which is based on sowing the seeds of life. And he was a trained economist. That was his real job. He was a Marxist economist who chucked Marxism and wanted to find something that was actually real.
Is this the?
And I think you see this. You know, one of the nice repercussions of the current pandemic is there is a more at least in this country, more of an emphasis on local sources for food, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which is, I think, really healthy. I mean, I think kind of a localist impulse. I mean, nothing, you know, a strict localist, but more localism. I mean, more of knowing our neighbors, more of knowing where we are, is probably a healthier way to go about things than the online communities that we have been thrust ourselves into in the last 15 years.
Unless there's anything you'd like to add, that was a great little discussion on Sophiology. So thanks very much.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael.